Starting on chapter 6, this is a pretty long PowerPoint slideshow. It's covering the years from 1865 to 1900, and I've tried to cut down some things because of our format and because of the fact that we have this week included 5 weeks left. Trying to make it simpler on you guys because, as I say, I don't know what any of you are going through. And I know some of you are going through more than others. So I'm trying to kind of help simplify things for you. But this one's pretty long. I don't know how long the narration is going to end up being, but I'll try to keep that short. So in my American history class, History 109, which covers the same period, we talk about Reconstruction as the turning point that never really turned because the United States was trying to heal from the Civil War. The South was destroyed. 20% of the adult white men were gone. Thousands more came home either severely wounded, sick. A lot of them, when they got home, died. There's the families in the South, most of them had lost men. The white Southerners had lost men. And that left the women in a unique position of taking charge in the South. So you also had the women taking charge during the Civil War, but also as they came back, just simply because of the great losses. Now, there were also 4 million slaves who were being set free after the 13th Amendment. And the problem is, most of them didn't have anywhere to go, and they had not been allowed to get an education in the South. There were laws that forbade teaching of reading and writing to slaves. So what were they supposed to do at this point? Because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, his vice president rose to the office of president. This is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, he had become a Republican when he joined the ticket with Abraham Lincoln. And that was in 1864. And he was a former slave owner. He was from the South. He was from Tennessee. He had, though, supported the Union all the way. So he has, he's a very unique character. Let's put it that way. I mean, he decides to call, instead of Reconstruction, he decides he wants to call it Restoration, puts it in place starting in the summer of 1865 when Congress was in recess for a while, as they do every year. So what he's going to do is he's going to offer amnesty to Southerners who take an oath of allegiance. Now, he was a pretty petty guy because he had been raised poor and he had trained as a tailor when he was younger. And then he was able to rise above, get some education and so on. But when it came time to offer amnesty, one exemption he made was men who owned property with a value of $20,000 in the money of the time would have to come to him to seek amnesty. Basically, I've always thought, it says a lot about him because he had this kind of a chip on his shoulder about wealthy people. So anyway, under his plan to get readmission to Congress, the states who had seceded had to revoke the ordinance of secession, abolish slavery, ratify the 13th Amendment, which actually does abolish slavery. Okay, it's one of the 3 Reconstruction amendments, and pay back the war debts of the North, the Union. Now he's going to have to deal with the radical Republicans, as are a lot of people during this time. I mean, President Johnson is going to be the first president to be impeached. Now, if we were in class, I would ask you how many presidents have been impeached. When I was a little kid and they would ask us that question, or when I was in high school, more likely they would ask us that question. And because we were young, we weren't paying much attention. A lot of times we would say 1, maybe, and the teacher would say, yeah, you're right. Who was it? Now, people my age who were young at that time would have said a lot of times, Richard Nixon. Maybe you would have even said Richard Nixon or thought of Nixon. Well, Nixon was never impeached. The articles of impeachment were drawn up against Richard Nixon, but he actually resigned before he was impeached. Now remember, you got to understand impeachment means the trial. Okay, it's going to be brought to trial. You're going to have the House draw up the articles of impeachment. It's going to be brought to trial in the Senate. So how many presidents have been impeached? Three. Andrew Johnson, okay, Bill Clinton in 19, what was it, 98, and then just, oh, very, very, very recently, Donald Trump. So that wasn't going to work anyway, as far as Donald Trump, because what did I just say? It the House is the one who draws up the articles of impeachment, and they're supposed to be for high crimes and misdemeanors. But the Senate is the one who conducts the trial, and the Senate today is majority Republican. So, again, I said from the beginning that impeachment was something that was definitely not going to be useful regarding Donald Trump the way that politics are at the moment. But remember, impeachment is not the removal of a president. The impeachment is actually the whole process and the trial. The goal is to remove a president, but none of the three who have been impeached have been removed from office. Okay? So, the Democrats were divided in 1860 and 1864, which is when Andrew Johnson joined the Republican ticket with Abraham Lincoln as his vice president. So, the Democrats at that time were very much supportive of slavery. Okay. They were very much supportive of keeping the black men in particular in a subordinate position in the South. Okay. The South used to be called the Solid South because it was so heavily Democrat. You could just count on the South because it was Democrat. Now that changes from the 1800s, 1860s, and, as we go through history and we come forward up until now, there's several things that the Democrats and the Republicans have shifted sides on. Okay, there's a few things that they have shifted positions. And one of those was that the Democrats were the party of slavery at that time, and the Republicans were the party that wanted to free the slaves. And some of these Republicans, who are called the radical Republicans, wanted to grant the right to vote, grant suffrage, to the black Southern men. Now, why? Well, everything's about politics. It's either everything in the world seems to be either politics or money. So you've got the radical Republicans knowing that if they granted the right to vote to the black Southern men who had been freed from slavery, partially with their help, then these black men in the South would probably vote Republican. And that was good thinking. They were right about that. The radical Republicans also wanted to punish the Confederate leaders. Now that was kind of a given. I mean, everybody in the Union, as everything ended with the Civil War, most people in the North are going to want to punish the Confederate leaders. But the radical Republicans went one step further. Okay, they wanted disenfranchisement of many Southern whites. Okay, now disenfranchisement means that you are taking away their right to vote. So that meant taking away the right to vote of many Southern white men. And remember, Southern whites were fiercely Democratic and, Democrat Party, and really wanted to keep the black men in particular in a subordinate position. Now, radical Republicans wanted to protect the rights of the newly freed black men and women, okay? And they also wanted to take the property of wealthy white Southerners who had helped the Confederacy. Now, that would be quite, a few of the wealthy white Southerners. Now, you have to also understand that, well, okay, then they wanted to distribute that property to the former slaves so they would have a way to support themselves. But you have to understand also that most white people in the South, the majority did not own slaves. Okay, there were the big plantations, and if a white family owned slaves, most of them had very few. But in reality, again, most of the white Southerners supported what was called the peculiar institution. Okay. So the radical Republicans are really wanting to help the former slaves rise up above where they have been. Okay, so the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, I don't have on here the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment started it all because the 13th Amendment is going to be the one, as I said, that freed the slaves. Okay, 13th Amendment. Now, the second part, then, after you free the slaves, would be to make them citizens. Okay, so in the 14th Amendment, we have the first constitutional definition of American citizenship. This is where everyone born in the United States and everyone naturalized is a citizen and entitled to equal protection. That's called the Equal Protection Clause. That causes a little trouble sometimes in court cases because what exactly does equal mean and what exactly does protection mean? Lawyers, right? I have a brother who's a lawyer, and they can definitely argue over anything, especially wording and what does it mean. And, speaking of impeached presidents, President Clinton, I don't know if you're old enough to remember it. I don't think you probably are, but there was a whole thing when he was going through impeachment that President Clinton was talking about the definition of the word is. Anyway. So you're going to have constitutional lawyers and so on arguing about things like the Equal Protection Clause. Now, the Citizenship Clause. Citizenship Clause is going to provide a broad definition, okay, of citizenship, and here's what happens. As of 1857, we mentioned the Dred Scott case. We mentioned the fact that the Dred Scott case had said that even though he was taken, he and his wife, and I think children, but definitely Dred Scott and his wife had been taken into a non-slavery state. He sued and said, look, if I've been living in a free state, I'm free. Well, the Supreme Court in 1857 said, no, 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 you're not, because you're not a citizen. You cannot be a citizen of the United States. So the Citizenship Clause is the big part. It's not the only part, but it's the big part that has to do with giving the former black men in particular the right as citizens, which will lead to, of course, the next step, which will be the right to vote. But first, let's finish the 14th Amendment. Continuing with the 14th Amendment, I'm going to pull out a couple of things here too. The Due Process Clause prohibits the state and local governments from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without certain steps being taken to ensure fairness. Okay, so they can't just come and arrest you and put you in jail and whatever. I mean, there has to be a process, in other words. Now, again, there's the Equal Protection Clause. Again, I said about the Equal Protection Clause that you're going to see people arguing about what is equal and what is protection. So the Equal Protection Clause at this time is going to require each state to provide equal protection under the law to all people within its jurisdiction. Okay, so that comes down to the states. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and this is, or it will rule on this a couple of times, but the Supreme Court is going to overturn something that we've already talked about back in, what was that, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. The clause, the Equal Protection Clause, again, they're going to fight out what do those words mean? What is this actually trying to say? And that's the job of the Supreme Court. The job of the Supreme Court is not to make laws, but to interpret laws under the Constitution, right? So the clause is going to be the basis for the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case in 1954. This was the decision that began integration of the races in schools. Okay, and that was extremely controversial. And you're going to see this again, the 14th Amendment. The 13th, you free the slaves. 14th Amendment, you give them citizenship, and you try to provide protection and due process and all these things spelled out that citizens have, which includes the black men and women in this case, as far as citizenry and as far as being free. Now, you're going to see that in 1971, Reed versus Reed was a Supreme Court case that also went back and ruled regarding the Equal Protection Clause. And so back in those days, now I don't remember this because I was just itty bitty in 1971, but the Supreme Court ruling in Reed versus Reed had caused me, I don't know, at some point, look up a bunch of old, I love to read old things, old newspapers, old whatever, magazines, journals, whatever I can find, of course. But there's a lot of things that you guys may not know, and a lot of people may have even forgotten about if they live through it because it's so interesting and absurd in light of today's world. But when you would turn in a resume, for example, to work at a job, you generally listed things like your height and weight and your marriage status and if you had children. I mean, those were all things that were actually legal to ask. And what happened was we also saw in the newspapers there would be jobs that were listed as men's jobs and women's jobs, however they would phrase that. But there were certain jobs that, that were gender specific. Okay. So that's going to start to change because Reed versus Reed is going to say that if you're requiring just again arbitrarily for no reason anything other than gender or sex, if you're requiring sex discrimination, then that violates the Equal Protection Clause. So all these Reconstruction amendments, I think, are really just vital to understanding the core of some of our values, the way that they are spelled out as Americans. On this slide, I just give you part of section 2. Okay, of course, if you go and you look up the entire amendments, these amendments, some of them are longer than the others. But I want to call your attention to the fact that in the 14th Amendment, they're addressing gender for the first time in the Constitution. Okay, so you read that and you see the word male. I've highlighted it. I don't think I missed any. I've highlighted it 3 times where they specifically say male, okay, citizens of the United States, blah, blah, blah. And you read through that and you're like, huh, okay. So they're very clearly, specifically talking about the right to vote there. Now, the 15th Amendment is actually going to be different because the 15th Amendment, as we'll see in a minute also, but what I have down at the bottom, the 14th Amendment mentions gender because they don't want anyone to think that just because we're talking about citizens and all that women can get all, fancy and think they could vote, right? So the 15th Amendment is going to be different because it's going to focus basically on black men getting the right to vote, okay? And they do that by putting things in the 15th Amendment that specifically address race, color, previous condition of servitude. Okay, so women are intentionally not included. So if you have time, I mean, I know again this pandemic stuff is affecting everybody in different ways. I have no idea what anybody's going through. I know that working at home is very much overrated because I would much rather be in front of you guys talking to you in person. But, we'll make it through all this. We'll get through it. We're pretty resilient, I think, as humans usually are. So let me go on then to the 15th Amendment. So the beginning of that, it's pretty much what I just said, okay? States and federal government cannot deny the right to vote to any male citizen. Male, again, is bold because of race, color, previous condition of servitude. Now, that's not going to help the black men for a long time, okay? Because you can still give them literacy tests. And remember, the black men and women, the slaves in the South, were not allowed to have an education. They couldn't read or write generally. So literacy tests, that's not going to work. Property requirements, well, you're going to see if you study enough about this era. We're not going to go into it really in here, but if you study enough about this era, you'll see that the black men were throughout many of the states were not allowed to have any jobs after they were freed except for agriculture. Okay? They also were forbidden from owning agricultural property, farms of any kind, or leasing. Okay, so wait a minute. What? We're basically saying to the black men, well, you know, you can't really have any jobs that would that would allow you to do something different other than basically working in the fields for the most part. So you also can't buy or lease property. So the property requirements would kick them out. And then poll taxes. Well, heck, they don't have any money. How are they going to pay to vote? So we see very realistically that many black men were still denied the vote for a long time in certain areas of the South. Okay. Now, the other part of that is if you had a poor white guy, he was probably much like the black guy. Okay. Probably couldn't read and write, probably didn't have much property of it all, probably couldn't afford to pay a tax to vote. So, what we see later are the grandfather laws, where they would literally have, say, a white man who would be more likely to vote Democrat, and a black man who would be more likely to vote Republican. And you would see them ask questions like, can you read, write, you own property, and so on. But then if it got right down to it, the black man and the white man had answered all those questions negatively. And so then the guy would say, okay, so looking at the white man, was your grandfather a slave? Well, no. Okay, you can vote. Looking at the black man, was your grandfather a slave? Yeah. Well, sorry, you can't vote. So again, there's loopholes built in there big enough for, one of the huge trains that they were building and putting on the tracks during the transcontinental railroad and the railroad boom that happened right around this time. It's crazy. One thing you've got to realize is that the radical Republicans, for all the great things they are out there presenting regarding helping the black men in particular, but the former slaves in general, they aren't really quite up for women to get the right to vote. Okay. So the radical Republicans want the black men to get suffrage first, and boy, were they loud about it. Radical Republicans said, that if we try to get women's rights to vote passed at the same time as the black men's right to vote, then I forgot who said this, but one guy said it would doom black male suffrage. Well, this made some of the women who were working for the right to vote just furious, and it led some of them to question, if all black men, were, well, now how did they say that? I read that, I think it was in your textbook, it may have been in another book, but they sort of, one of them questioned aloud at some point something like, were all black people male, or something like that? So in other words, we're just, hey, what's going to happen here? We're either going to have to get together and work for black men and women to vote at the same time, or we're going to have to split. Okay. So you have many women and some men, there's going to be some notable men that are going to join in and start working even harder for women's rights. Remember Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, back, Seneca Falls, New York. This was a turning point with women really standing up to try to get the right to vote and to get more rights. But what are they going to do at this point? They've got a hard road ahead of them. So again, this is going to make the resolve a lot stronger for some of the women and some of their male supporters. So we have the American Woman Suffrage Association that was founded in November of 1869. Now, the reason it formed was due to a split in the American Equal Rights Association over what we were just talking about, the 15th Amendment. Now, the founders of AWSA supported the 15th Amendment, and you have a very important woman here, Lucy Stone. She's going to be big in the women's movement earlier than this, okay? But they, you know, well, you're going to see that Lucy and her husband, Henry Blackwell, are founders of the AWSA, but they were also abolitionists. So they really wanted the black men to have the right to vote. So, believing in states' rights and things that needed to be passed at the state, they thought the same way, just like the radical Republicans did, that if the 15th Amendment included women's suffrage, it would not pass. Okay, so we have the AWSA supporting the 15th Amendment without the women's right to vote. So here we have a portrait of Lucy Stone, a portrait of Henry Blackwell. Okay, so when they got married, he was very supportive. He was, one of the men that really stood up for women's rights. Now, recall though that as I said on the previous slide, he and Lucy supported the 15th Amendment without women's suffrage in it. So anyway, these two, though, their wedding is interesting because he renounced all non-mutual rights given to the husband in a marriage. Okay, he was well ahead of his time. He was very much a feminist as far as that goes. And at the wedding, the couple read a marriage protest that they had written together. And she, I think, was the very first woman we know of in the United States who kept her own name after marriage. Okay, but certainly not the last. So Lucy Stone, just a little tidbit also about her, was she was the first woman, I believe, in Massachusetts who got a college degree, if I'm not mistaken about that. I think I don't remember where the college was, but I'm pretty sure she was the first one in Massachusetts to get a college degree. And also, when they did their whole marriage protest at their wedding, it was basically the protest. I'm trying to think of how to put this. It was basically they were protesting the idea, and they had, again, they'd written this together. It was a signed document between them that rejected the idea that a husband would have legal control over his wife. Now remember that femme sola and femme covert. Femme covert, the husband, his legal identity covers hers. So they went completely against that. You also, if you're thinking about the whole identity of the women and all of that, I mean, like I was saying earlier about the 1970s when Reed versus Reed came up until I can't remember when it ended, like completely, but it was still going on in as late as the 60s and probably, I believe, the 70s, that if a woman wanted to get a credit card, if she was married, she had to ask her husband. It had to be in his name, that type of thing. So anyway, we're making progress as we go through this class. Yeah, we're seeing little glimmers here. So Lucy Stone and Blackwell had supported the 15th Amendment with suffrage for black men because, they said that they eventually knew it would lead to women's suffrage. Now, everybody doesn't see it that way. So on the other side of the split, we have the National Woman Suffrage Association, National Woman Suffrage Association, founded in May of 1869. So we've got the NWSA working to get women's suffrage by going for a constitutional amendment, okay? And the others, the American Woman Suffrage Association, the AWSA, I know there's a lot of acronyms and stuff to remember, But the other ones, the Lucy Stone and stuff, they had believed, remember, in state by state campaigns, and that's the way they wanted to address it. Okay, so the National Woman Suffrage Association. Sorry, I may have had a little glitch there. Hope it's not. I hope I'm not repeating the same thing. But okay, so we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony forming the NWSA to try to get a constitutional amendment, and then you're going to see that Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell and their supporters, the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, so many acronyms there, they believed in states' rights to gain the vote. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some others are going to do something very controversial. They're going to publish something they call the Women's Bible. Women's Bible was a work of fiction. Okay, it was something that was written basically um, as a way to call people's attention to the idea that women should not be considered inferior and therefore supposed to be subservient to men all the time. Okay, so that was the whole purpose of the Women's Bible, and you can imagine the controversy when that came out in the late 1800s. I think this off the top of my head, most of this stuff, and sometimes you can tell is off the top of my head, but I think that was published in 1895. But anyway, it was really controversial. Okay, so the NWSA, we'll go on and talk about them a little bit more on the next slide. We're going to talk about something called the New Departure, which I think is really kind of cool and kind of gutsy here. You've got the NWSA proposing an interpretation of the 14th Amendment that relied on the word persons. Okay, now remember, 14th Amendment, we go back to the 14th Amendment and we see things like definition of citizenship, we see citizenship clause, we see due process clause, we see equal protection clause, we see all that kind of stuff. But in part of section 2, we see gender being referenced. Okay, so the new departure is going to hit a roadblock pretty quickly, but here's what's going on. Okay, again, they're trying to get the right to vote. This has been a long battle, and remember, it won't be won until 1919 with the passage of the 18th Amendment, and women have the right to vote nationwide 1920. But they said that women had the right to vote. You know, they're going to rely on the word persons in parts of the 14th Amendment, and they need to just take the right. Again, new departure. So Victoria Clayton Woodhull is going to popularize this argument, and she's going to become well known as to some people as a troublemaker and to some people as a hero. And she was allowed to speak in front of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee arguing the new departure. She said, look, the 14th and 15th Amendments grant suffrage to all citizens. Well, that impressed some committee members. You know, they're like, wow, okay, that sounds logical to us. So we see that in 1871, I don't know why it says 1871-71. Okay, but in 1871, many women just went and voted. They told the poll workers, the men, that it was their constitutional right, and usually the men just stared at them and allowed these quote crazy end quote women to vote. So if you go and read the 14th Amendment, you know, go look at it sometime in your free time, and you'll see she's relying on, again, the word persons, but it very clearly says, as I showed you on an earlier slide, male. So yeah, okay, you know, she's trying to argue that the word persons is going to override the word male. And she says that it grants suffrage to all citizens. She's relying on citizens and persons. Well, okay. So anyway, a lot of women went, voted, and again, the men didn't know what to do. And that's not going to be the first, or I'm sorry, that's not going to be the last time that happens either. Here's the woman herself, Victoria Clayton Woodhull. Okay, now she's going to be controversial. She's going to be an advocate of free love. Okay, and remember we've talked about at some point who coined the term free love. If we were in class, I would ask you if you remembered that. But anyway, Victoria Clayton Woodhull is going to be an advocate of free love. Again, we know what free love means. I mean, she believes that you should be allowed to have, have relationships outside of marriage. And she's a supporter of small government, anti-capitalist, okay, which is interesting. A lot of times big governments are going to be anti-capitalist, or big governments can be anyway. It depends. Different times through history, but if you look at a lot of the big governments, they're definitely anti-capitalist. Not all of them, but you're also going to see libertarians, for example, who basically are the second cousins kind of the anarchists who wanted no government at all. So libertarians want a lot of things left up just to the people. So anyway, you've got Victoria here being the first woman to start a weekly newspaper along with her sister Tennessee. Okay, so you need to know about her sister Tennessee Clayton. Now they were these children. These are these young women actually. She was born Victoria Clayton, and she was the seventh of 10 children, and not all of them died, as was kind of normal back in those days, of course. And she's going to become, I don't know, she's going to become very well known for a lot of things, but being the first woman to start a weekly newspaper with her sister is only one of them. I mean, she had a father who was basically a con man. He was kind of the guy that would cheat people out of money and so on. She believes in spiritualism, and she believes in um, some kind of ghost and so on. And she believes that there's a lot of things that supported her ideas about free love. Now, as adults, Tennessee, her sister Tenny, and Victoria worked together. They worked founding a stock brokerage as well as their newspaper. And what we see about Victoria, I mean, she's going to get married when she was young, and she's going to find out that this marriage was not for her because her husband was abusive and alcoholic, and she had to work to support, the family. She ended up having two children with that man. I can't remember his name. And then she's going to marry another guy later on. But anyway, some people say that maybe her support of free love perhaps started after she found out how her first husband was cheating on her. Don't know. I mean, it's funny because when we look back, and this is something we've mentioned before in class, when you got married as a woman in the 19th century, you're pretty much stuck. Okay, you don't have a way to go make money and support yourself usually. You're also not going to be able to get a divorce very easily. And if you do, I mean, it's going to make you a social outcast, okay, at that particular time. So Victoria ends up determining that, hey, you know what? Women should be able to leave marriages that are not healthy for them. In that case, again, she was well ahead of her time. Now, she believed again, that a lot of things came down to women's choice, and that was what she was a big advocate for. Okay. And she's going to rally against hypocrisy and all sorts of things. But in her journal, her and her sister's newspaper, she got really controversial when she expressed a support for legalized prostitution. Okay. Okay. Again, that's still controversial to this day. Now, in 1872, she is going to be, I always say arguably, the first woman to run for president. Now you have to, I have to explain this because I say arguably because Hillary Rodham Clinton is the first viable candidate that we had to run for president. Okay. The thing about Victoria here is that she was running on this third party, first of all, the Equal Rights Party ticket. That wasn't going to work. Okay. Second of all, women didn't even have the right to vote. So come on. She's not going to be allowed to hold public office, even if by some miraculous intervention she had won. That would have been a huge problem. So I remember seeing in 2016 when Hillary was running, I remember seeing the stupidest meme ever. Don't ever try to get your history from memes. You guys know better than that anyway. But I saw this really stupid meme that said something like Hillary Clinton couldn't even tell the truth about being the first woman who ran for president. Now, really? They're going to dig back here to a candidate who had literally not a viable party or a viable chance. And then they're going to go to Hillary Clinton and say, she lied about being the first woman. Did that? I don't know. I'm speechless at that. It just annoys me every time I think about it. Sorry. Get a little bit crazy when it comes to people and their stupidity, as probably we all do. As I mentioned before, she and her sister Tennessee, or Tenny, they opened a brokerage firm on Wall Street. So they were the first women to actually, operate this brokerage firm on Wall Street. Now, again, she had been made fun of in the media and treated really badly. She had been called a lot of names. Now, I promised you guys that we would come back to Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher's brother, who was a reverend. Okay? Told you we would come back to him for a scandal. Well, here we are. Okay? So, in the Woodhull and Clayton's Weekly, she devoted an issue in 1872 to this adulterous affair between the Reverend Beecher, prominent Protestant minister in New York, and Elizabeth Tilton. Now, here's where she was doing what we see a lot of people trying to call out today and really throughout most of history. She was trying to call him out on his hypocrisy. Okay. He's a reverend. He's preaching against adultery. But he had been on the record as being wildly opposed to free love. Okay. So she published this article to highlight what she saw as the hypocrisy, the double standard between men and women. Well, here we go. This is another one of those old-timey things, as they say on my favorite podcast, Sawbones. She was arrested on obscenity charges. Wait a minute, she didn't have an affair. He did. Okay, never mind. All righty, let's just talk this out. Well, okay. How did that happen? Okay, here's what happened. She's arrested on obscenity charges under what was called the Comstock Law because she had sent this article to her subscribers using the United States Postal Service. In other words, the Comstock Law prevented people from sending pornography or pornographic materials through the United States mail. Anyway, their standards for pornography were, you know, different from where we are today, I think. The new departure argument finally makes it to the Supreme Court. Okay, 1875, Minor versus Happersett. Virginia Minor is going to sue the man who had denied her the right to vote. Again, the women are at various times just going up and saying, hey, I'm a citizen, I can vote. Supreme Court said different. Okay, so okay, you're a citizen, but here's, again, here's the loophole. You're a citizen, but voting is not a right, but a privilege. Now you have to understand that a privilege means it can be taken away. Okay, so just because you are a citizen does not mean you have the right to vote. I mean, I hear a lot of people always saying stuff about the right to vote. Now, keep in mind, there are times, if we were in class, I would ask you to name some time that you could imagine or that you can think of when someone could lose their right to vote. Remember, we've had the whole argument going on about whether felons should be given back their right to vote. So voting is not a right, but a privilege. Now, the problem with this is that it also, though, narrowed the 14th and 15th Amendments in ways that helped to remove the right to vote from black men. Meanwhile, the South is still going through Reconstruction. And in 1877, we only had Reconstruction in the South properly, or sort of properly, from 1865 to 1877, because there was an election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden in 1876. And, you had one that got the popular vote and one that got the electoral college vote and so on and so forth. Anyway, they made a deal that the North would actually remove the federal troops from the South if, and that would benefit, of course, the Democrats in the South. And in exchange, they would let Rutherford B. Hayes become a one-term president. So after the federal support is gone, I mean, the South is just going to run amok with discrimination. Okay, so again, 14th and 15th Amendments are being stripped of a lot of their importance. The Supreme Court says that these amendments prevented government from discriminating. That's still a problem today. I mean, we see that come up every once in a while in my classes, and there's cases about people not wanting to make, I don't know, cupcakes for a same-sex marriage or something like that, or a pride parade or whatever. Okay, and you can take that out to its logical conclusion, and I've heard lawyers say, or at least I don't remember who was the guy that made the best argument, but someone I was listening to was talking about how, look, if you're open for business to the public, that means the public, I mean, we decided a long time ago we weren't going to discriminate. So how can you discriminate against, say, gay people, or, LGBT, whatever, and women and black people or Latino, whatever, just fill in the blank with people you could discriminate against. So the Supreme Court at that time is saying, well, it's okay if the government doesn't discriminate, but the private the private companies and organizations, they can discriminate if they want to. They don't want black people in here or whatever. They don't have to bring them in, okay? Or they don't have to allow them in. Goes to hotels, railroad, theaters, everywhere in the South. We're going to have legalized segregation. So on slide 19, the laws created to disenfranchise black voters, the Jim Crow laws, named after a character wearing blackface. These were created to humiliate the black men in particular. Bringing out the poll tax, literacy test, and so on. It's gonna cause the black men who were voting in really good numbers for a while, it's going to cause their vote to decrease by 62% by the 1890s. Now, what we saw was in one of President Grant's election, it was either 68 or 1872, but the black men in the South, it was like 500,000 of them, had been allowed to vote, okay, and actually went out and voted. And he only won the popular vote by a 300,000 margin. So if the black men had not come out to vote for him, you know, he was a Republican, and who knows. But anyway, by 1890s, it just wasn't, the black vote just wasn't there anymore, decreased so much. So we have the passing, these are the laws that we mentioned about, was your grandfather a slave? And that's where we get that term about someone being grandfathered in. After the federal troops left the South in 1877, we're going to see things get even worse with the racial conflict. But to start with, I mean, we've got in the southern areas where the blacks were either a majority or the blacks and whites were about equal, you're going to start to see the whites use intimidation, violence to stop the black men in particular from making gains, okay? KKK is going to be the largest of these groups that I think we would call white terrorist organizations. And the KKK is going, the Ku Klux Klan is going to absorb the other terrorist organizations, the white terrorist organizations in the South. Now, KKK was formed in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, and one of its best known leaders was a former Confederate General, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, so the purpose of the KKK is to scare the black men in particular. I could say, black people, but I mean, the black men are generally the targets of so much of of trying to quote, put them in their place, end quote, right? So, because I mean, remember, women couldn't vote or anything else, so that was kind of a lesser thing that they were thinking of. But anyway, the KKK is going to absorb the other white terrorist organizations and become quite powerful over time. So, what's going on with black women in the South? Reconstruction time, Civil War's over. White men in the South had lost control over slave women's bodies, remember, and their labor. You started to hear rumors spread by white men that black men were predatory and that they wanted to just have as many women as possible. They wanted all the white women, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to see that the irony in that is that white men had been the ones taking advantage of slave women for generations. One of the most terrible things going on in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War is lynching. Okay, that's not going to go away for quite a long time. But lynching black men for sometimes nothing, okay, except for being black, and sometimes lynching black men, which means, pulling them out of their house, tying them to a tree, and hanging them from a tree. So sometimes there would be some suspicion of sexual aggression toward white women, but for whatever reasons, lynching went sky high in this time period. Many black women lost their husbands, sons, and other male relatives to this violence, and it was spreading constantly. Ida B. Wells, one of the greatest women you may have not ever heard of. Okay, she was a black woman, a journalist, a teacher, lecturer, newspaper editor, all sorts of things. Also, a suffrage activist. And she's going to investigate these false charges that were being made against black men. Now, her attempt here ultimately had been to try to get white men and women to condemn these fake charges that were being made against black men. So Ida B. Wells, she started investigating lynching, and that's going to be really her big one of the biggest things that she leaves behind as a legacy. But three of her friends were murdered. There was a guy named Thomas Moss and he had two more co-owners of a place called the People's Grocery. Now, what was happening was they were doing really well, black men owning a grocery store, and they were actually really competing with the white grocery stores. Okay, so they were killed. Now, supposedly Moss, in his last breath, said, whoever he was telling it to, tell my people to go west. There's no justice for them here. Okay. Now, Ida is going to argue that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment apparently doesn't apply if you're competing against a white man. Well, okay. So, I mean, she's outspoken. I like her. I've always liked her. And again, that's why I'm surprised that a lot of people have never heard of her. So she published her findings over time in a pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws and All, or in All Its Phases. You can find that online. You can read that for free somewhere online if you're so inclined to do so, if you have time. But then she started to lecture, go around. There's a lot of that, going around from a lot of these women that we've seen as they get to be in a more acceptable situation where they're allowed to do these things. And what we see is as she went around to lecture, you're not going to see her attempting to be a feminine, you know, you're not going to see her trying to appear more feminine than she was. Okay. So, the way she spoke and everything else, she was just being herself. And a lot of people, they didn't like that. They thought, in other words, maybe she was too tough. And again, you're going to hear women who are just basically standing up for themselves, called bitches and all other sorts of things through history. But she was really just, she was in a role that had been generally reserved for men for the most part. Okay. Now she's going to call for a boycott in Memphis and the railway boycott. Oh my gosh, she is in so much trouble at that point. She becomes a wanted woman, literally. I mean, she has a price on her head for a while. And she published an article in her newspaper called The Free Speech. And, well, there she becomes even more of a visible target for the people who hate her. So she leaves town and her newspaper's closed down. Now she didn't leave, she wasn't running away. Let's make sure you know that. But she went out of town. Her newspaper's closed down, and she'd given orders to punish anybody who tried to open it up. Now she was warned that there were plots to lynch her, that armed men were watching every train coming into the city, ready to kill her on sight. I don't know about you guys, but man, I would have been so terrified. I probably wouldn't have unlocked my door. I probably would have hidden somewhere. But I'm not as gutsy as her. Now, it turns out that the Free Speech Office, her newspaper, was looted and burned to the ground. The people who were working barely escaped the mob. Now, she was given a very clear warning that when they caught her, she would be hanged from the nearest lamppost if she ever set foot back in Memphis. Now, again, me, I would have never set foot back in Memphis because I'm a big old chicken. But she didn't run. I mean, she continued the fight, and she's going to bring up the fact that black women are victims of lynch mobs sometimes. Now, that wasn't something that happened a lot as far as black women being lynched. However, her argument also rested on the fact that women are losing male relatives in big numbers because of this crazy lynching. Now, she disagreed with Booker T. Washington, very famous former slave. He wanted blacks to concentrate on getting working skills, training instead of education. He's also going to be in disagreement with one of my very favorite writers, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was a black essayist, great intellectual, great thinker, and Booker T. Washington wants the black men to go out and prove themselves to the whites and earn their rights and all this kind of stuff. And W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. White say, look, there's no reason for that. Why would we have to prove ourselves anything? We're people, we're citizens, okay? This is crazy. So anyway, she becomes a founding member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909, along with many other prominent people. Look up the founding of the NAACP if you have a chance, and you'll see quite a few names that historically you will definitely recognize. Okay, we'll address the working girls. Now, these are the women who work for wages, usually in the factories. Sometimes as a domestic, housekeeper or something, sometimes working in a shop. But they were called working girls in a derogatory way. And working class women weren't often taken seriously by the middle and upper classes. The expectation of these working girls was that she'll work till she finds a man, then she'll quit. Okay? If you're a woman who is still working when you're married, you're going to be looked down upon. So men were paid a lot more than women because the idea was that the men had to support their family. So you had the family wage. The truth is that already in the late 1800s, about 10 to 15% of urban women are single mothers, okay, supporting their household. So that idea of a family wage and we're going to pay women less than we pay men really took a toll on these women trying to support themselves and their children. Now, again, as I said, working women who are married are going to be looked down on by just about everybody in society at that particular moment in time. So black families got a double whammy because not only were, the women not expected to work, but they also didn't really have the men being paid the family wage. So black women were more likely than white women to continue to work after marriage because of those things. Okay, so some of the working women, black and white and everything, are going to still live at home with their parents. Some left home because they had a lot of bad conditions. Maybe they couldn't make it back at home because there was abuse or whatever, maybe they just, needed to leave where they were. There's as many different answers to that as I'm sure that there are people. But you're going to see women joining labor unions that would allow them. Now, not all labor unions allowed women. The Knights of Labor did allow women workers to join with them in solidarity to fight for, in one thing particular, an 8-hour workday. So, jumping right over then to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, kind of feel like I skipped around a little bit, but I mean, there wasn't that much to say specifically to end that section. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, don't try to memorize those acronyms. And thank goodness on this test you'll have notes. I mean, that's, you guys did well on the first test, but you'll do even better probably on this one. Anyway, temperance. Remember temperance? We're trying to get people to not go to extremes with anything. That's what it means. But as Sherry in class brought up, temperance a lot of times meant to them just complete ban on alcohol. So they formed the WCTU to help people on a personal level cut down on alcohol consumption, which they thought would spread through society. And then as they grow, they're going to end up fighting for more things, getting involved in more things. Okay. For example, they're going to start to support unions and fight for labor laws to protect workers, prison reform, because, oh, wow, prisons during that time were just brutal. If you've never read about prisons from the 1800s, you've got to read. The brutality is just, it's unbelievable. And the WCTU are also going to join in, fighting for women's suffrage. Now, they're working against tobacco and illegal drugs also, but the most significant leader, the one that I want you to know, is the one who gets them into some of those different things rather than just alcohol. Okay, this is Frances Willard. Okay, she was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the first dean of women at the very prestigious Northwestern University at age 34, which, if you don't know, that's extraordinarily young for such a high position, especially in those days for a woman at such a university. So the WCTU is going to be around, but after you enter into the 20th century and then the 18th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, passes in 1919, the membership is going to decline somewhat, and they're not going to have nearly the importance they used to have. But that's an important moment, okay, with Frances Willard at the helm. They're gonna be out there rallying for many, many things, as well as women's suffrage, okay, in addition to all the others. So the mid to late 1800s, the time from about the end of the Civil War to the outbreak of World War I in 1914 is sometimes called the Gilded Age. And this was a title actually of a book by Mark Twain back in the era. But the Gilded Age, it refers to something looking nice and maybe even beautiful on the outside, but being rotten inside, or cancerous or corrupt or whatever inside. So the Gilded Age is a pretty appropriate term that we can use to describe that particular period. It was an interesting period. Now, it's a time of a lot of changes, okay? We're going to be able to bring our industrial world or our industrial forces into a very important part of the world economy, as we're going to become a leader in the world. Now, Great Britain had been known as the workshop of the world. It's where the Industrial Revolution started, was in Great Britain. But by the time we get here after the Civil War, and as we're headed up toward the 20th century and so on, we're going to end up becoming, really just a leader in the world. Now, the railroads and the peripheral industries, and by that I mean things that you used to create railroads, like the steel and the oil and the glass and everything else, right? So the railroads and the peripheral industries made not only quite a few millionaires, multimillionaires, like Andrew Carnegie and Jay Gould and so many others, but we also see the first billionaire, John D. Rockefeller. Okay, so Gilded Age is going to be a time of great wealth for the wealthy, as the gap is going to really start to grow between the poor and the rich. As I said about the Gilded Age, though, the glitter, or the gold or the beauty on the outside is covering up the terrible things that are inside, the rotten or horrible things that are going on underneath the surface, right? So this is a period of greed and corruption in industry and politics. This is the time where you're going to have some of the bosses in the parties, Republican, Democrat parties, playing a lot of political games and controlling really their cities in many ways through the politics, and picking who's going to become the next, whatever, police commissioner or whatever. Okay. So a lot of greed in the politics, a lot of greed and corruption in industry as well. We're going to see people like I mentioned, Jay Gould. He was a guy who was one of the names they float about a lot during this time period was robber barons. Had a lot of the guys who were working with the railroads who were making a ton of money, but not necessarily being honest in the way they were making their money. And Jay Gould was one of them. Okay, he was called the Prince of the Robber Barons. Not a nice thing to be called, really. But Jay Gould was known for buying broken down railroads and putting a little bit of cosmetic changes into them and then selling them at a great profit. Okay. So you also see, looking at the poor, many of the immigrants that have come over. Remember, this is the biggest time of immigration in the United States at this moment in time, right here, late 1800s, early 1900s. We have millions. I think it was 25 million that were just pouring into the United States at that time. Many of the immigrants are unskilled at that point in time, and they ended up working in factories for hours, sometimes like we talked about before, for 16 hours a day for very little pay with no breaks, hardly any, hardly any free time, just horrific for women and men. And I probably should have put children on there too, because we do see a lot of children working in those factories in terrible conditions. Now, for the middle and upper classes, we start to see nice restaurants being a place that couples would go or families would go. See, the interesting thing is, before this period, men would go out to eat at restaurants by themselves. That wasn't really a thing. You didn't go out to dinner with your, wife or your girlfriend. Same thing about the theater. It was kind of beneath the women in the eyes of society for them to be seen at a theater or to be seen at a restaurant or something like that. Well, that changes here in this time period. And we start to see things that look even more like modern America, right? Going to the theater, in that case, it was play, but going out to dinner, for heaven's sake, not now in the middle of the pandemic, but. And then also summer vacations began to be popular with the people who could afford them. Now, you're going to see in the 1920s, that's going to get even better because of the automobile and the rise of the automobile. But summer vacations, the idea that we can, spend this time with our families and do things together, that started to be a real thing that took on a whole life of its own during the Gilded Age. So, for women, middle class and upper class, women that had some kind of means to buy things, the most important new convenience was the department store. I don't know. Department stores are still around. I don't think they don't seem to be nearly as popular and I guess profitable probably as they were when I was younger in the 80s. When we had mall culture, all of the department stores, you've got the mall, you've got Sears, you've got J.C. Penney, you had Montgomery Ward, you have all these things that some of you may have never even heard of. Those are department stores where you go in and there's clothes over here and there's other stuff over here. It's just what a department store is. Well, this is when it came about, okay? And I'm not going to say that department stores are dead right now, but they're definitely, I think they're on their last breaths, as so many of them have been closing over the years, because I think a lot of the big box stores like Walmart and Target, for example, here in Elizabethtown, um, those kind of stores seem to have really taken over because of things like, I don't know, um, I'm trying to think of what would be, because I'm thinking one of the major reasons for the decline eventually of the department store, I mean, a lot of it had to do with the decline of the mall, but I think a lot of it's probably that when we started to get Walmart and places like that that were actually pretty cheap, it was easy. You go in there and hey, everything's just right there, and it's cheaper than going over here to wherever. And um, it just seems like a natural, almost kind of a natural thing happens. We'll create something new, and then it'll become the old, and then it'll eventually go away. So the department store is born during this era. Now, the cool thing is you go in, and of course, like I said, you know what a department store is. If you've ever been in a J.C. Penney or a Sears, you know what it is. But everything was on display. You could browse around, you could see the prices. No one was going to bother you to make a purchase, and whatever. So window shopping also became a pastime. You had a lot of stories of the young working girls that were in the cities, they would go out at night and they would go by and they would look in the windows and they would dream of what they would like to have. So we do see that becoming a pastime. Now, there's another thing going on here is if you were working as a factory worker, if you were working as a domestic, a housekeeper or something, that's not going to be as, quote, respectable, end quote, for women as, say, a store clerk. Okay. And also we're going to see secretarial jobs on the increase and some other things that are going to increase toward the end of the Gilded Age. But working as a store clerk became a respectable job at this point. Used to be men that worked as store clerks. Now, it was still meant to be temporary, though, until you met the man, but it was a respectable job for women at that point. Now, store clerks had to be, they had to act, they had to present themselves in a certain way. Okay, you had to have middle class dress and habits and mannerisms and mode of speech and everything else. In other words, this would be specific women who were able to get hired in those department stores because they knew they were going to be, the people who hired them knew they were going to be mingling with the upper class. Okay, so women of the upper class and the working class are mingling together as customers and clerks. Okay. We're going to finish up here with Hetty Robinson Green. And I think she's mentioned in your book just a little bit, but I'll tell you a little bit more about her because I think she's extraordinarily interesting. So she was known as the richest woman in America during the late 1800s, and she was known for her penny pinching. So anyway, her father um, her father, he's going to end up leaving her money, and she's going to be a woman who knows how to invest. I mean, she's very, very smart. Supposedly, I say supposedly a lot. Here, one time I noticed I changed it to allegedly, but some of this stuff has got to be legend about her, and and we'll talk about that in a second. But she invested very wisely. She would always say that she would buy the stocks that nobody else wanted, and then she would hold on to them till somebody wanted them, and then she would sell them. So, okay, yeah, I mean, if I had the money to do that, that sounds logical to me in some ways, especially if you had millions of dollars. Sure, why not? So, the things that are legendary about her that again, I don't know if this happened and some of it probably, but I don't believe all of this to the extreme. Supposedly, she never turned on her heat or her hot water because she was so cheap. She would wear one black dress and a pair of underwear and only change after the dress and underwear were worn out. Now that one seems a little bit of a stretch. Maybe, I don't know. Supposedly she didn't wash her hands. I have no idea why that story is out there. I mean, what would be her reason? I don't know. And she ate mostly really cheap pies. And when I looked that up about cheap pies, I mean like 10-cent, 15-cent pies. And then so that would be what in today's money, if we're talking about way back here in the late 1800s, oh gosh, that would be just still just a few dollars. I mean, it wasn't really expensive pies. She wasn't going out and buying these really fancy things, cheap pies, okay? Which always makes me imagine those little tiny ones that they have in places like Kroger, little tiny lemon cream pies or something. But anyway, washing her hands, nah, okay, and eating cheap pies, okay? Who knows? Now, she is known for saying, just because I dress plainly, so she is admitting that she doesn't dress, like someone of her wealth, and don't spend a fortune on gowns. Wait, people, it's supposed to say people say that I am cranky or insane. Just because people don't spend a fortune on gowns, it should say people say that I am cranky or insane. I don't know how I left that out. I don't know what I did there. I'm sorry. But yeah, okay. So they expect her to act like what their vision of a woman is. This comes up time and time again, right? She's called the Witch of Wall Street. You ever hear a man called anything quite like that? I mean, the men, if they made the money she did, and if they were so good at investing, you still didn't hear them called names like that. Again, I go back to Hillary Clinton and the horrible that she was called a hag. She was called a bitch. She was called so many. I don't even want to go into them because you can probably remember at least some of those. But when you have a powerful woman, a lot of times these men and society as a whole sometimes really don't like it. Okay, so she was so rich that she actually loaned the city of New York money several times, okay, to get them out of debt and to keep them running. Wow, we might need her today these days with everything going on. Now I'm going to end this slideshow by saying that your test is going to be over. Remember from the assignment sheet, chapters 4, 5, and 6, and you've got everything you need. Let me check while I'm still on here. You should have everything you need to do. Um, Hang on, like I said, give me a second to make sure. This PowerPoint will be posted as soon as possible. Sometimes at night it takes a long time. There was one that took all night to post. I don't know if it was for your class or another. But anyway, as far as your weekly checklist goes, let me double check this. So I know that your study guide for your test, I remember saying if there's anything that you can't find in the PowerPoints and lectures, because most of it's going to be all over that. But if you can't find anything, since you do have a study sheet, please look it up in your book, or if you have to, Google it, find something about it. But the due date for this one, remember, is going to be April 5th. Okay, April 5th, which is a Sunday. And I'm telling you to go back and make sure you haven't missed anything. And it says at the moment I was typing it, you had 2 narrated PowerPoint videos from chapter 5. Now, as soon as this one can go up, you'll have 3. Okay, this one from chapter 6 on the Professor Rigney channel. And try to listen to all of them and take notes on them. Go back and review your chapter 4 material too, because exam 2 will be covering chapter 4, 5, and 6. As I said, please be reviewing that. Okay. I'm going to give you some quizzes over chapter 5 and what did I say? And chapter 6. Okay. To be honest, I'm going to have to figure out what to do with those because I'm kind of doing everything from scratch for my 6 in-person classes. So I'm I'm really trying to make sure that if I make any mistakes, that you guys please let me know. I'm trying to make sure I don't make any crazy mistakes. But anyway, let's see what else. The quiz is based on the lectures, in this case, also your study guide. And then exam 2, chapters 4, 5, and 6, like I said just now, 3 or 4 or 5 times. But it will be based on the lecture and the PowerPoints and that study sheets the study sheet that you have. But it's timed, okay? It'll be timed to an hour and a half, just like if you were in the classroom, unless you have some accommodations through ADA. Okay, your ADA person is Teresa Brown out at the college. And the due date will be Tuesday, no, or April 7th, which will give you a couple of extra days after you hopefully have taken care of everything else. Then you'll have a couple extra days to sit down and then worry the um, about the exam. So I want you to email me if you have any questions. I want you to study, 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 and I will work on getting the chapter 5 and 6 quizzes created as fast as I possibly can. Thank you guys so much for your patience. You're awesome. And again, I'm trying to keep it going as, to the best of my ability. Thanks.